Right, so you can imagine it must come as some sense of relief that at last somebody is taking up the case all the Palestinian people against the Israeli genocide we're all witnessing. And I've gone into exactly what South Africa have done there in my other video earlier tonight, so go watch that after this. The case they put together is incredibly detailed and as harrowing as you might imagine it to be. But Gaza have issued a response to this via their Hamas-led government, which, if such a statement elicits feelings of boo and hiss in you, then you're missing the point of them still being the elected government in Gaza, regardless of who deems them terrorists instead. You can define them by their actions, but in doing so, you also have to define them by the situation they exist under, and the situation they came into existence under. But also realise they're speaking on behalf of people, most of whom, the vast majority of whom, are not Hamas anyway, and their message is not one of calling for more death and destruction, but one you ought to perhaps listen to, especially if you're the sort of person who has been saying Gaza deserves what it gets. Right, so South Africa have submitted an 86-page case against Israel under the terms of the Genocide Convention to the International Court of Justice. They aren't hanging about with it either. They have asked for the case to be expedited, given the ongoing atrocities, and they've asked the court to convene in the next few days to issue provisional measures under the terms of the convention, calling for a ceasefire, which would therefore be binding according to international law. Seems obvious, given a court will have issued such an order, doesn't it? Would Israel obey it, though? Probably not. They broke the week-long ceasefire in November repeatedly, whereas Hamas obeyed it, as they have on previous ceasefires. But in this case, they've already accused South Africa of blood libel, having brought this case against them. No contrition, no acknowledgement, just screaming victim as usual. If you aren't familiar with the term blood libel, it's not just claiming anti-Semitism, it's claiming anti-Semitism on steroids, because it's basically claiming that South Africa have accused them of killing Christians in order to drink their blood. It goes way past their usual level of jumping the shark in their accusations of anti-Jewish racism, conflating their state's existence with the Jewish faith as they do, falsely. Nobody gets to play the religion card to excuse state-sanctioned atrocity, in my view. It's more jumping the shark, doing a 360 around the moon and coming back down to earth again. Perhaps. Ultimately, though, if such a ceasefire ruling were passed and Israel did as expected break it, then it can surely only result in international opinion swaying against them all the more. Deservedly so, wouldn't it? But nowhere was the news of this case being brought to the attention of the International Court of Justice more welcomed than Gaza itself, where the Hamas-led government there have issued a statement saying, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, we highly appreciate South Africa's initiative to file a request to the International Court of Justice to commence investigations against the criminal Israeli entity for committing the genocide against our Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. South Africa's move is an important step towards holding the leaders of the entity, the criminals of our age, accountable for the most heinous massacres known to humanity in our contemporary history. We call on all nations to submit similar files and requests to the competent criminal courts, both national and international, against this Nazi entity, as it poses a threat to international peace and security, and to ensure that it does not escape punishment for the brutal crimes committed against children and unarmed civilians in the Gaza Strip." They put that statement out earlier today. Now, you can pick on the language, but I suggest you aren't living it. So harsh words, at the very least, they are entitled to use, and I say that fully in mind of what they did on October the 7th, and not excusing them at all for that. But this is about the 11 weeks following that where Israel had been razing Gaza to the ground. The Gaza leadership certainly are not advocating for more violence here, and nor do they incite more on their own part. It is a letter of thanks to South Africa and a message to all other nations signed up to the Genocide Convention, bearing in mind that 152 countries worldwide are signed up to it, and only one has lifted a finger here to take Israel to court. Those spectating, not exactly placing a lot of importance in a convention designed to prevent the wipeout of fellow human beings here, does it? For those sneering at this statement perhaps, and thinking, why on earth should the words of terrorists be taken notice of? But then I think of the nation bringing the case to the ICJ here, and I think you should as well think about that. South Africa itself. And I'm reminded that Nelson Mandela was once branded a terrorist too. Margaret Thatcher did so while she schmoozed with the likes of Chile's General Augusto Pinochet, a guy who rounded up opponents in stadiums, much like we've been seeing Israel do in recent days in Gaza, haven't we? Mandela's African National Congress, the ANC, was branded a terrorist organisation too, yet it later formed the government that set South Africa on a very different path, a path to where it is today, holding others to account for atrocity and apartheid, learning from its own history and seeking to teach those same lessons to others now. Who you define as a terrorist now may not be seen by history as that. It is a right under international law to resist occupation. You might not agree with how Hamas have done that. I do not agree with how Hamas have done that. But if Israel didn't occupy Gaza, didn't blockade Gaza, Hamas may never have needed a reason to ever exist. Where people call them terrorists, I see them as a symbol of the shame of other nations for letting this go on for as many years as it has. 1948 and the Nakba, why was nothing done then? 1967 and the Six-Day War and the following ensuing 56-year occupation, why has nothing been done in that 56 years? 2007 and the blockade of Gaza following Hamas's election to authority in the Strip, why has nothing been done? This has gone on for far too long, and the world has let it. Now finally, for the first time, another nation has sought to hold Israel accountable for the crime of genocide, and it's done so in 86 pages, and it literally only covers the events since October 7th of this year. Can you imagine how big a file it could be if South Africa had gone back any further? Heavens, it would probably take them years to put it together. There is no shortage of case material other nations can't join in with on this case, can't include in submissions of their own. They could always go back further themselves, build on the work of South Africa here. So if Hamas is the living embodiment of the shame of other countries for doing nothing up until now, then the South African case against Israel is the legal equivalent. Hamas have said to the world in their statement to make your own submissions. Please help us. Well, do it then, preferably before those still even now backing Israel to the hilt decide to try and contest it by bringing similar against the occupied people of Palestine, because frankly, looking at some countries, it feels like that is only a matter of time before that happens, and I'll be talking about that in a matter of days. Perhaps it'll be the UK government doing that. After all, they've just sent 1,000 more troops to the Eastern Mediterranean and won't tell us why. All on Israel's doorstep for no reason at all, I suppose. Yeah, right. You can find out all about that if you watch this video next, and I'll hopefully see you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.